What if I told you that the greatest empire ever known didn't fall to external invasion, natural disaster, or slow decay, but tore itself apart in a single, catastrophic act of grief? Welcome back to the channel. Today, we're diving deep into one of gaming's most tragic and complex civil wars, the Shattering. This isn't just a story about demigods fighting over a throne. It's a tale of how a mother's anguish shattered reality itself, how siblings turned weapons against each other, and how an age of golden prosperity descended into centuries or perhaps just decades of ruin and madness. The exact timeline of these events remains unclear. George R. R. Martin, who wrote Elden Ring's backstory, mentioned the Shattering occurred 5,000 years before the game's present, though this may reflect a different conception of time in the lands between where death has been banished and demigods live for ages. Other evidence, including Ranni's recollection and the apparent youth of characters like Millicent, suggests the Shattering may have been more recent, perhaps only decades or a century or two before the Tarnished return. What matters is not the precise dates, but understanding the scale of devastation and the forces that caused it. Over the next hour, we'll explore every aspect of this cataclysmic event. We'll walk through the streets of Leyndell before the fall, witness the conspiracy that started it all, and stand on battlefields where gods bled and entire regions were transformed into wastelands. We'll examine the motivations of each demigod, the strategic decisions that defined the war, and the cosmic consequences that still echo through the lands between today. This is the story of the Shattering, and by the end, you'll understand why the world of Elden Ring looks the way it does, why the Tarnished were called back, and what really happened during that terrible time when the lands between tore themselves apart. So settle in, get comfortable, and let's begin our journey into one of the most devastating conflicts in gaming history. Before we can understand the horror of what was lost, we need to see what the lands between were at their peak. Picture this: a realm where death itself had been conquered, where golden light touched every corner of the world, and where the rule of Queen Marika the Eternal seemed as permanent as the stars themselves. This was the Golden Order, an age of unprecedented prosperity, divine lore, and cosmic stability that stretched back beyond living memory. At the center of it all stood the Erd Tree, that massive golden colossus whose roots spread beneath every land and whose branches seemed to pierce the heavens themselves. The Erd Tree wasn't just a symbol, it was the literal source of grace, the force that blessed the chosen and gave structure to reality. From its roots, souls would return after death, reborn in eternal service to the divine hierarchy. This wasn't metaphor or religious belief. This was the actual function of existence in the lands between. Death, as we understand it, simply didn't exist for those blessed by grace. Queen Marika the Eternal ruled from Leyndell, the royal capital, a city of such magnificence that even its ruins would later inspire awe in the Tarnished who explored them. Imagine towers of white stone and gold reaching toward the sky, streets paved with blessed marble, fountains that flowed with waters touched by grace itself. Every building, every statue, every decorative element proclaimed the glory of the Golden Order and the permanence of Marika's reign. But Marika was more than just a ruler. She was a living goddess, the vessel of the Elden Ring itself. That cosmic symbol of order wasn't an abstraction or a piece of jewelry. It was the fundamental structure of reality, the code that governed the laws of existence. Through Marika, the greater will, that alien intelligence from beyond the stars, imposed its vision of perfect order upon the world. The history of how Marika achieved this position reveals the foundation upon which the Golden Order was built. She was Numen, a member of a long-lived race from distant lands, who had been chosen as an Empyrean, a being capable of serving as a vessel for an outer god. Her selection by the greater will elevated her from mortal to divine, giving her the power to reshape the world according to cosmic law. But godhood required a partner, a champion who could enforce divine will through military might. Enter Godfrey, the first Elden Lord, originally known as Hoarah, a barbarian warrior of such savage strength that he required a beast regent, Sirosh, grafted to his back, just to temper his bloodlust. Together, Marika and Godfrey forged the Golden Order through conquest. The wars of unification were brutal and comprehensive. Godfrey's armies, led by his legendary Crucible Knights, swept across the lands between like an unstoppable tide. They broke the fire giants in the frozen peaks of the mountaintops of the giants, slaying their fell god and ensuring that the flame of ruin could never threaten the Erdtree. They drove the ancient dragons from their seats of power, though even the mighty dragon lord Placidusax was forced to retreat beyond time itself, rather than face complete annihilation. In the underground realms, Godfrey's forces battled the Omen and other creatures deemed impure by Golden Order doctrine. The message was clear. Embrace grace or face extinction. Many people submitted, finding places within the new order as soldiers, craftsmen, or servants. Their cultures were absorbed, their histories rewritten to fit the Golden Order's narrative. Those who resisted to the bitter end were erased so thoroughly that even their names were lost to time. The golden lineage that emerged from Marika and Godfrey's union seemed blessed by every possible measure. Godwyn the Golden, their firstborn, embodied the ideal of what the Golden Order promised to create. He was beautiful, noble, beloved by all who knew him. In battle, he was without peer. He had even befriended the ancient dragons after defeating them in single combat, an act that transformed ancient enemies into allies. In peace, he was wise and just, earning devotion from nobles and commoners alike. Yet beneath this golden surface, cracks had already begun to form. The very perfection of the Golden Order contained the seeds of its own destruction. Consider the fundamental contradiction. Marika had banished the rune of death, sealing it away with her shadow Malekith, to create a world where those blessed by grace could live forever. But removing death from the natural cycle created instabilities that manifested in disturbing ways. Those who live in death began to appear shambling undead creatures that shouldn't exist in a world where mortality had been conquered. They were the first sign that something was deeply wrong with the cosmic order. Then there were the Omen children, born with cursed horns and bestial features that marked them as impure in the eyes of Golden Order doctrine. Even within Marika's own family, these flaws manifested. 2 of her sons with Godfrey, Mohg and Morgott were born as Omen. Rather than being celebrated as princes, they were hidden away, their existence deemed shameful by a regime that preached the inherent superiority of those touched by grace. The hypocrisy was stunning. The goddess who ruled the world had given birth to children that her own laws deemed abominations. Religious dissent simmered beneath the surface as well. The Golden Order demanded absolute faith in the greater will and its earthly representative, but other beliefs persisted in the shadows. The wandering merchants, descendants of a nomadic people, whispered of the frenzied flame, a chaotic force that promised to burn away all distinctions and reduce the world to primordial unity. Their music, played on instruments of bone and hide, carried melodies that spoke of older, wilder times before the golden light imposed its sterile order. At the Academy of Raya Lucaria, the glintstone sorcerers pursued knowledge that sometimes conflicted with Golden Order doctrine. Though nominally allied with the regime through political marriage, the Academy remained a bastion of intellectual independence. Their study of the stars and cosmic forces beyond revealed truths that challenged the supremacy of the greater will. Princess Ranni, daughter of Rennala and stepdaughter to Marika, would prove particularly troublesome in this regard. The nobility itself was not immune to internal strife. Ancient bloodlines nursed grudges against the golden lineage, viewing them as upstarts who had seized power through conquest rather than legitimate inheritance. Regional governors chafed under central authority, dreaming of the days when their ancestors ruled as independent kings. Ambitious generals looked with envious eyes upon the wealth and privilege enjoyed by those closest to the throne. Most ominously, tension was growing within the royal family itself. As Godfrey's campaigns of conquest reached their inevitable conclusion, with all external enemies either defeated or cowed into submission, his usefulness to Marika's grand design began to wane. The very qualities that made him invaluable as a conqueror became liabilities in a world that increasingly demanded administrators rather than warriors. The signs were subtle at first. Those who knew Godfrey well noticed that the fire had dimmed in his eyes, that same fierce light that had once driven him to victory after victory. He had conquered all there was to conquer, and without enemies to fight, the great warrior found himself adrift. His regent beast Serosh could sense the growing restlessness in its host. Meanwhile, a new champion was rising. Radahn of the Golden Order, a red-haired warrior of exceptional skill and devotion, had emerged as a military leader during campaigns against the Carian royal family. His marriage to Rennala, Queen of the Full Moon, had been both a diplomatic triumph and a personal victory, achieving through alliance what military force alone could not: the complete integration of Aeonia into Marika's empire. From Radahn and Rennala's union came 3 children who would play crucial roles in the coming catastrophe. Ranni, born with the potential to become an Empyrean like her stepmother. Radahn, who would grow to become perhaps the mightiest warrior of his generation. And Rykard, brilliant and ambitious, who would eventually preside over the volcanic fortress of Mentgelmir. The transition came with the surgical precision that marked all of Marika's political maneuvering. Godfrey and his warriors were stripped of their grace, the divine blessing that had sustained them through decades of service. Banished from the lands between, they were forced to wander the wastelands beyond, becoming the first of the tarnished. The official explanation was that their purpose had been fulfilled, that conquerors were no longer needed in an age of consolidation. Radagon's elevation to second Elden Lord was presented as natural evolution. His marriage to Marika united 2 of the realm's most powerful figures. His marriage to Marika united 2 of the realm's most powerful figures. The birth of their twin children, Miquella and Malenia, was hailed as a sign of divine blessing. Yet even these blessed twins bore signs of cosmic imbalance. Miquella remained trapped in a child's body, unable to grow, while Malenia was afflicted with scarlet rot, a supernatural disease that slowly consumed her flesh. These curses were omens of troubles to come. The Golden Age, for all its magnificence, was built upon contradictions that could not be sustained indefinitely. The banishment of death created unnatural conditions. The concentration of power in demigod hands created potential rivals for ultimate authority. The suppression of competing ideologies drove opposition underground where it festered. Most critically, the very success of the Golden Order had eliminated the external threats that once united its disparate factions. As decades passed, the generation that witnessed the great conquests gave way to children and grandchildren who knew only peace and prosperity. Without the crucible of conflict to forge unity, the various factions began pursuing their own agendas. The demigod children of Marika, each powerful beyond mortal comprehension, developed their own spheres of influence. Godwyn, as eldest and most beloved, naturally assumed leadership among his siblings, but the others were not content to remain in his shadow. Radahn built his reputation as the strongest demigod, learning gravity magic to enhance his already formidable martial prowess. Rykard accumulated forbidden knowledge, and Ranni began to question the very foundations upon which her stepmother's empire rested. As an Empyrean, Ranni possessed the potential to become a god in her own right, to reshape cosmic order according to her own vision. The prospect of eternal servitude to the 2 fingers and their alien agenda filled her with revulsion. In the depths of her study, surrounded by scrolls and star charts, she began formulating plans that would eventually shake the heavens themselves. The signs of coming catastrophe were there for those with wisdom to see. Storms gathered more frequently around the Erd Tree. Those who live in death appeared with increasing regularity. Strange new stars appeared in the night sky. In the depths of the royal capital, ancient prophecies spoke of a time of testing, when the foundations of order would be shaken. But the nobility, insulated by wealth and privilege, remained largely oblivious. Their lives continued to revolve around court politics, social gatherings, and ceremonial obligations. Few could imagine that they were living through the final peaceful season of their civilization. The shattering, when it came, would arrive with the sudden violence of a lightning strike, transforming the ordered world they knew into a nightmare of war and chaos that would endure for generations. To understand the shattering, we must understand the gods and demigods whose conflicts would tear an empire apart. These weren't mere mortals squabbling over territory. They were beings whose very existence reshaped reality, yet each was driven by very human emotions: love, hatred, ambition, despair. At the center stood Queen Marika herself, perhaps the most complex and contradictory figure in all of Elden Ring's lore. She was simultaneously the architect of the Golden Order's greatest triumphs and the instrument of its ultimate destruction, a being of such divine power that she could reshape reality, yet so tormented by loss that she would choose to shatter existence itself, rather than continue living within its constraints. But here's where things get truly mind-bending. Marika and Radahn were the same entity, not in a metaphorical sense, but literally. Two aspects of the same divine consciousness capable of manifesting as separate individuals. This revelation, discovered through various item descriptions and the final boss encounter, transforms our understanding of everything. Radahn embodied unwavering loyalty to the greater will and absolute faith in the Golden Order's righteousness. Where Marika might question or doubt, Radahn remained steadfast. This suggests an internal division within the god herself, a cosmic tension between rebellion and devotion that would eventually manifest in the most destructive way possible. Now let's talk about Godwyn the Golden, perhaps the most tragic figure in this entire tale. As Marika's firstborn son with Godfrey, he represented everything the Golden Order claimed to embody. Contemporary accounts describe him in terms that suggest divine perfection made manifest. His beauty was legendary. His nobility of character earned him love from all who knew him. His prowess in battle was unmatched, but Godwyn's greatest strength was also his fatal weakness. His very perfection made him a symbol of the Golden Order's legitimacy, and symbols, by their nature, become targets for those who would challenge what they represent. His death wouldn't merely eliminate a powerful rival. It would strike at the heart of everything the Golden Order claimed to be eternal and unassailable. Godwyn's friendship with the dragon stands as one of his finest achievements. After defeating the ancient dragon Fortisax in single combat, he chose not to humiliate his foe but to offer alliance. This act transformed centuries-old enemies into loyal allies. Dragon cult incantations, the very magic that would later be practiced throughout the lands between, emerged from this alliance. Godwyn had proven that the Golden Order could achieve through honor what it had previously only accomplished through violence. The relationship between Godwyn and his siblings was complex. By all accounts, Godwyn bore his status as eldest son with grace, never flaunting his position. Yet his very existence served as a constant reminder to the others of their secondary status in succession. This created tensions that would later prove catastrophic. Miquella the Unalloyed presented perhaps the most poignant contradiction among Marika's children. Blessed with wisdom and charisma that could sway even the most hardened hearts, he possessed the potential to become the greatest leader of his generation. His understanding of cosmic forces exceeded even that of many older scholars. His compassion for the suffering of others drove him to seek solutions to problems that had plagued the world since the Golden Order's inception. Yet Miquella remained cursed, trapped in the body of a child unable to grow or mature despite the passage of years. Imagine the frustration, a mind capable of understanding reality's deepest mysteries, helpless to change his own fundamental nature. This vulnerability made him dependent on others for protection, particularly his twin sister. Malenia, Blade of Miquella, embodied strength through adversity in ways that would be impossible in a purely human context. The scarlet rot consuming her flesh would be a death sentence for any mortal, but her divine nature allowed her not merely to survive, but to transform her affliction into a weapon of terrifying power. Her mastery of swordsmanship reached supernatural levels. The waterfowl dance, her signature technique, allowed her to cut down multiple foes in a single flowing sequence of strikes. Her devotion to Miquella went beyond simple sibling affection, approaching religious worship. She saw in her brother a vision of what the world could become under enlightened leadership, free from the rigid hierarchies and arbitrary cruelties of Golden Order rule. But the rot that plagued Malenia also made her a weapon of mass destruction, whose very presence could transform entire regions into hellscapes of disease and death. Her control over this power was incomplete, making her dangerous even to those she sought to protect. The knowledge that she carried within herself the potential to destroy everything she held dear created constant tension. Radahn, known as the Star Scourge, represented the pinnacle of martial prowess among the demigods. His physical strength was legendary even by divine standards. He had to learn gravity magic simply to continue riding his beloved horse Leonard without crushing the creature. His mastery of both blade and sorcery made him formidable in any form of combat. But Radahn's true claim to fame lay in his ongoing battle against the stars themselves. Through his gravitational magic, he held back the movement of celestial bodies that threatened the lands between with cosmic catastrophe. This constant vigilance required tremendous concentration, making him as much guardian as warrior. His willingness to sacrifice personal comfort for others' protection earned respect even from potential enemies. The relationship between Radahn and his father Radahn was marked by genuine pride and affection, rare emotions in a family where political calculations usually trumped personal feelings. Radahn had taught his son that true strength came not from dominating others, but from disciplined use of power. This lesson would shape Radahn's approach to both war and peace. Rykard began his career as one of the most promising members of his generation. His intellect rivaled Miquella's, while his understanding of cosmic forces was formidable. As praetor of the Golden Order, he wielded judicial authority, earning a reputation for fairness. Yet Rykard's intelligence led him down darker paths. His studies into the true nature of cosmic law brought him contact with forbidden knowledge. The transformation consuming him began with small compromises, minor transgressions that seemed justified by greater good. Each step made the next easier, until he embraced blasphemies that would have horrified his younger self. His ultimate fusion with the god-devouring serpent at Gelmir represented complete rejection of everything he once stood for, though exactly when and how this occurred during the Shattering remains unclear. Ranni the Witch, born lunar princess Ranni, possessed perhaps the most dangerous combination of attributes among all demigods: the power of an Empyrean, the intellect of a master sorcerer, and the will to challenge cosmic order itself. Unlike her siblings who largely accepted their roles within existing hierarchy, Ranni questioned the fundamental assumptions upon which their world was built. Her study of the stars and forces beyond revealed truths few others were willing to acknowledge. Her relationship with stepmother Marika was complex, marked by both genuine respect and fundamental philosophical disagreement. Ranni understood that Marika had achieved godhood at tremendous personal cost, but she rejected the idea that this justified the suffering imposed upon countless others. Thrills were the stow, Caelid, though idle round, Hain sinulang cest, but she rejected the idea that this justified the suffering imposed upon her. Athelm. Ranni's vision of an alternative future, one where the lands between could exist free from outer gods and their manipulative servants, would drive her to commit acts many would consider unforgivable. The path that led her to orchestrate the Night of Black Knives emerged not from simple rebellion or personal ambition, but from growing understanding that the current cosmic order was fundamentally unsustainable. Mohg, Lord of Blood, represented the dark mirror of his twin brother, Morgott's noble sacrifice. Where Morgott chose to defend the very system that rejected him, Mohg embraced his status as outsider and sought to build alternative power structure based on rejection of Golden Order values. His discovery of the formless mother and outer god, promising power to those willing to embrace blood and sacrifice, provided both means and justification for rebellion. The dynasty Mohg, built in underground depths beneath Caelid, represented complete inversion of Golden Order principles. Where the surface world preached order and hierarchy, the Godwyn dynasty celebrated chaos and transformation. Mohg's obsession with his half-brother Miquella was deeply personal. He saw in the eternally youthful demigod a kindred spirit, another being trapped by circumstances beyond his control. His plan to force Miquella into godhood so they could rule together as consorts revealed the depth of his isolation and desperate desire for meaningful connection. Morgott, known to most as Morgott the Fell Omen before his true identity was revealed, embodied perhaps the most tragic loyalty in the entire saga. Despite being born as an omen and rejected by the very society he would spend his life defending, he never wavered in devotion to the Golden Order and his mother, Queen Marika. His willingness to serve as guardian of Lendel, standing against all who would claim the throne, demonstrated nobility of spirit that put many of his more blessed siblings to shame. The internal conflict Morgott experienced defending assistance as abomination speaks to depths of character few could comprehend. Think about what this means. Morgott knew he would never be accepted as legitimate heir, yet his absolute conviction that the Golden Order represented the best hope for peace and stability overcame all personal grievance. His battles against other demigods during the Shattering were particularly painful, as he was forced to stand against siblings who might otherwise have been natural allies. These, then, were the principal actors in the drama about to unfold. Each possessed power that could reshape reality. Each was bound by limitations and contradictions that would prove their undoing. Their conflicts weren't merely political but deeply personal, rooted in family dynamics shaped by centuries of divine politics and cosmic responsibility. The stage was set for catastrophe. When crisis came, it wouldn't be resolved through negotiation or compromise, but through violence on a scale that would leave scars visible for generations. On a winter evening when fog rolled thick across the lands between, covering the golden light of the Erdtree in a shroud of grey mist, the course of history was forever altered. This was the night of Black Knives, an event so shocking in its audacity and devastating in its consequences that it would serve as the catalyst for everything that followed. The conspiracy that unfolded had been months, perhaps years, in the planning. It required a level of coordination and secrecy that could only have been achieved by someone with intimate knowledge of the royal family's routines and access to powers existing outside the Golden Order's protective embrace. The Black Knife assassins who carried out the deed were no common cutthroats. They were elite warriors whose very existence had been carefully hidden from authorities. These assassins were all women Newman like Queen Marika herself, scions of the Eternal Cities who had mastered arts of stealth and combat that made them nearly unstoppable when properly motivated. Their armor was crafted to make no sound. Their movements were so fluid and precise they could pass through guarded halls like shadows made manifest. But what made them truly dangerous were the weapons they carried, black knives imbued with a fragment of the rune of death itself. The theft of this fragment from Malekith, Marika's loyal shadow and guardian of destined death, represented a violation of cosmic law so profound that its very possibility should have been inconceivable. Malekith had bound the rune of death within his own being, making himself a living seal protecting the world from mortality's return. Yet somehow, a fragment of this ultimate power was stolen. Evidence suggests with Rykard's assistance and refined into weapons capable of killing even the immortal. The ritual transforming these ordinary daggers into god-slaying weapons was performed by Ranni herself, using knowledge gained through forbidden texts and communication with forces existing beyond the greater will's influence. The incantations required were ancient beyond measure, their words carrying echoes of power predating the Erdtree's golden age. To speak them was to invite cosmic retribution, yet Ranni did so willingly, understanding that some prices were worth paying for freedom. The timing of the attack was carefully calculated to achieve maximum psychological impact. Godwyn the Golden wasn't merely the eldest son of the royal house. He was the living symbol of everything the Golden Order claimed to represent. His death would prove that even the most blessed and protected demigods were vulnerable to mortal weapons wielded by determined foes. The assassins approached their target through routes scouted and planned with military precision. They moved through the royal capital like ghosts, their concealing veils rendering them effectively invisible to guards who should have detected their presence. The protective wards and magical barriers surrounding the royal quarters' defenses, crafted by the greatest sorcerers, proved as ineffective as morning mist against their advance. Finding Godwyn required intimate knowledge of his habits and preferences, information that could only have come from someone with access to the most private areas of the royal family's residence. Whether this intelligence was provided by a willing collaborator or obtained through subtler means remains speculation, but its accuracy was evident in the mission's success. The confrontation was brief but decisive. Godwyn, despite his legendary prowess, wasn't prepared for multiple assassins wielding weapons that could bypass divine protections. The Black Knife assassins struck with coordinated precision. Their leader carved the curse mark of death into Godwyn's flesh, a mark that should have formed a complete circle, but instead fractured into two incomplete halves. This splitting occurred because at the precise moment of Godwyn's death, Ranni performed her own ritual suicide. She carved the other half of the curse mark into her own flesh, causing her body to perish while her soul survived. This simultaneous death created an incomplete death, for both Godwyn's soul was destroyed while his body lived on. Ranni's body died while her soul endured. Ranni's death wasn't an accident or unintended consequence, but a calculated sacrifice designed to achieve a specific goal. As an Empyrean, she possessed the potential to become a god, but this blessing came with the terrible price of eternal servitude to the Two Fingers. By dying in body while preserving her soul, she could escape this fate while retaining enough power to continue pursuing her own objectives. It was brilliant, audacious, and absolutely ruthless. The splitting of the curse mark had consequences neither Ranni nor anyone else could have fully anticipated. Godwyn's soul was destroyed while his body lived on, transforming him into the first of those who live in death. His physical form, interred in the depths beneath the Erd tree, began to mutate and spread like cancer through the tree's root system. What had once been the most beautiful of the demigods became a source of corruption that would plague the lands between for generations. His remains would spawn the death root, and from that corruption would emerge the undead plague that Princess Fia and the deathbed companions would later embrace. Godwyn's death created a fundamental wound in the fabric of reality that could never truly heal. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Discovery of Godwyn's body sent shockwaves through the royal capital. The assassins fled through Lendel's streets, pursued by guards finally alerted to the catastrophe. In the battle that followed, several assassins were killed or captured, including Electo, one of their leaders, who was imprisoned in an Evergol. Another assassin, Tishe, died protecting her mother during the escape. The capture of some assassins provided authorities their first clues about the conspiracy's scope. Their identity as Newman, the same race as Queen Marika, raised disturbing questions about who might have been involved. The weapons they carried, clearly imbued with fragments of destined death, indicated access to powers that should have been impossible to obtain. News of the assassination spread across the lands between with supernatural speed, carried by ravens and riders bearing terrible tidings to every corner of the realm. In distant keeps and isolated villages, people who had never seen Godwyn the Golden wept openly at news of his death. He had been more than just a prince to them. He had been a symbol of hope, proof that the Golden Order's promises weren't empty lies. The psychological impact extended far beyond simple grief. For the first time since the Golden Order's establishment, common people were forced to confront the reality that even gods could die. The immortality promised to the faithful suddenly seemed less certain, while the cosmic hierarchy placing demigods above ordinary mortals appeared more fragile than anyone had imagined. But the true catastrophe, the event that would transform personal tragedy into cosmic disaster, was yet to come. For when Queen Marika learned of her beloved son's death, her response would shatter not just hearts, but reality itself. To understand what happened next, we need to comprehend something that defies human experience: the grief of a goddess. Imagine having the power to reshape reality itself, to rewrite the laws of existence, and discovering that despite all this power, you cannot bring back the one thing you've lost, that you cannot undo what has been done. According to those who witnessed her in the hours following the discovery of Godwyn's body, the goddess who had maintained perfect composure through centuries of rule was consumed by a rage that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. The golden light that normally emanated from her divine presence flickered and twisted, taking on hues that spoke of fury and despair beyond mortal comprehension. But Marika's grief was compounded by something deeper. Whether she had known of Ranni's plot, whether she had somehow facilitated it, or whether it represented a complete betrayal, these questions would be debated by scholars for generations. What we do know is that her response suggested this wasn't merely a mother's grief but something more complex. Some believe Marika had been planning rebellion against the greater will for some time, that Godwyn's death whether she anticipated it or not, became the catalyst she needed. An echo of her words, preserved at the outer wall battlefield, suggests premeditation. Hear me, demigods. My children beloved, make of thyselves that which ye desire, be it a lord, be it a god. But should ye fail to become aught at all, ye will be forsaken, amounting only to sacrifices. In her fury and despair, or perhaps according to some hidden plan, Marika made a decision that would echo through the ages. Using the hammer with which the Elden Ring had been forged, she shattered the cosmic symbol that had given structure and meaning to existence itself. The moment the Elden Ring broke, reality itself convulsed. The golden light that had blessed the lands between for centuries dimmed and flickered. The laws that governed existence became unstable and unreliable. Magic that had once been predictable became chaotic. Creatures and phenomena held in check by cosmic order suddenly found themselves free to roam and multiply. Think about what this means on a practical level. Imagine if gravity suddenly became optional, if time started flowing at different rates in different locations, if the very concept of cause and effect became negotiable. That's the scale of disruption we're talking about. The Elden Ring wasn't just a symbol, it was the operating system of reality itself. And Marika had just crashed the entire system. Radahn, Marika's other self, immediately attempted to repair what she had destroyed. Using the same hammer that had shattered the ring, he tried desperately to piece together the fragments and restore the cosmic order that had given meaning to his existence. Picture the scene. A god frantically trying to reassemble the shattered pieces of reality itself, knowing that every moment of delay allows chaos to spread further. But the damage was too great. The fragments were too scattered and corrupted by the violence of their breaking. His efforts, though heroic in their persistence, were doomed from the beginning. You can't unbreak an egg, and you can't unshatter the fundamental structure of existence. The best Radahn could manage was to slow the collapse, to contain some of the worst effects, but repair, true restoration, that was beyond even his divine power. The greater will's response to Marika's act of cosmic vandalism was swift and merciless. The entity that had elevated her to godhood and used her as its vessel for imposing order upon the world could not tolerate such open rebellion. The punishment it devised was exquisitely cruel in its symbolism. Marika was imprisoned within the Erd Tree itself, her divine body crucified upon a rune-carved framework that would hold her until the end of time or until someone with sufficient power chose to challenge the cosmic hierarchy directly. The goddess who had reigned supreme for centuries was reduced to a prisoner in her own seat of power, forced to witness the consequences of her actions while unable to undo them. But the punishment extended beyond mere imprisonment. The greater will withdrew its active support from the Golden Order, leaving the various institutions and hierarchies that had depended upon divine backing to fend for themselves. The grace that had blessed the faithful became inconsistent and unreliable. The protection that had shielded the realm from external threats began to weaken and fail. The Golden Order, which had seemed eternal and unshakable, revealed itself to be entirely dependent upon the active will of the god it served. Without that support, it was just another human institution, subject to all the weaknesses and failures that had plagued every other attempt at creating lasting civilization. And then came perhaps the most consequential result of the Shattering, the creation of the Great Runes. When the Elden Ring broke, it didn't simply disappear or become inert. It fragmented into pieces, each still containing a portion of the original ring's cosmic authority. These great runes scattered across the lands between like seeds of chaos, drawn to those with the strength and ambition to claim them. The demigod children of Marika, possessing the divine nature necessary to bear such tremendous power, became the natural bearers of these fragments. Each great rune that found a new bearer transformed both the holder and their domain in ways that reflected their fundamental nature. Godrick's fragment enhanced his ability to graft the strength of others onto himself, turning his desperate hunger for power into a supernatural compulsion that would drive him to ever greater atrocities. Radahn's rune amplified his already formidable strength, while binding him more tightly to his role as protector of the realm. Malenia's fragment, tainted by her affliction with scarlet rot, became a source of both healing and disease, a double-edged blessing that would prove catastrophic. Rykard's great rune fed his blasphemous hungers. Mohg's empowered his blood magic, and Morgott's reinforced his tragic loyalty to a system that had always rejected him. Each rune was like a corrupted, wish-granting artifact, giving its bearer exactly what they most desired, while ensuring that desire would ultimately destroy them. The immediate political consequences were profound. With Marika imprisoned and her designated heir dead, the succession to the throne became an open question for the first time in centuries. The various demigods, each now empowered by their possession of great runes, found themselves in positions where they could realistically claim the right to rule. But the great runes came with a terrible price. The fragments of cosmic power were inherently corrupting, filling their bearers with ambitions and desires that grew beyond all reasonable bounds. The demigods, who had once been content to serve the Golden Order as loyal princes and princesses, now found themselves consumed with visions of personal empire and divine authority. The transformation wasn't immediate but gradual, a slow poisoning of noble intentions that turned family bonds into political calculations and reduced loving siblings to potential rivals. The great runes whispered to their bearers of the power they could wield, the changes they could make, the wrongs they could right if only they possessed sufficient authority to act without constraint. Consider the psychological impact. Each demigod now possessed a fragment of the power that had once united the realm. Each could claim, with some justification, that they were the rightful heir to Marika's throne, and each had the strength to back up that claim with force if necessary. It was a recipe for disaster. Multiple claimants with near equal power, all convinced of their own righteousness, none willing to submit to the authority of the others. As word of these events spread throughout the realm, local governors and military commanders found themselves facing impossible choices. Their oaths of loyalty had been sworn to Queen Marika and the Golden Order she represented. But with the goddess imprisoned and the cosmic hierarchy in chaos, the meaning of those oaths became unclear. Some chose to maintain their allegiance to the established order, whatever its current difficulties. Others saw opportunity in the confusion and began positioning themselves for the conflicts they sensed were coming. Still others simply tried to protect their own people and territories, hoping to ride out the storm that was gathering. The common people, lacking the political sophistication to understand the full implications of what had occurred, simply knew that their world had changed in ways that filled them with dread. The golden light that had blessed their lives for generations now seemed uncertain and unreliable. Strange creatures began to appear in places where they had never been seen before, while familiar landscapes took on sinister aspects that spoke of corruption and decay. In underground cities and hidden settlements, where dissidents and outcasts had gathered over the centuries, news of Godwyn's death and the Elden Ring's shattering was received with emotions ranging from jubilation to terror. Some saw in these events the beginning of the Golden Order's long overdue collapse, the first cracks in a system that had oppressed them for generations. Others understood that the chaos to come would likely consume the innocent along with the guilty. The Knight of Black Knives had achieved exactly what its architect intended, complete destabilization of the cosmic order that had governed the lands between for centuries. But like all acts of revolutionary violence, it had also unleashed forces that could not be controlled or directed by any single will, no matter how powerful or determined. The stage was now set for the greatest civil war in the history of the lands, between a conflict that would pit God against God, brother against sister, ideal against ideal, in a struggle that would leave the entire realm transformed beyond recognition. The shattering had begun not with the clash of armies or the siege of cities, but with a single act of violence that proved even the immortal could die, followed by a mother's grief that shattered reality itself. The die had been cast, and now all that remained was to see how it would fall. In the immediate aftermath of the Elden Ring's destruction, the lands between existed in a state of shocked paralysis. The structures that had maintained order for centuries still technically existed, armies still reported to their commanders, taxes were still collected in some regions, courts still convened. But it was like watching a body move through muscle memory after the brain has died. The animating spirit was gone. The great rune's distribution among the demigods transformed this paralysis into active conflict. As each living demigod claimed their fragment of cosmic power, they gained not just enhanced abilities but also a claim to legitimacy that couldn't be easily dismissed. Each great rune represented a piece of the authority that had once resided in the complete Elden Ring. It's worth noting that Godwyn, having died before the Elden Ring shattered, never received a great rune. His death precipitated the shattering, but he gained no power from it, only the horrible fate of becoming the Prince of Death, his soulless body spreading corruption through the Erd tree's roots. Let's examine what each great rune did to its bearer, because this is crucial to understanding the conflicts that followed. Godrick the Grafted received his great rune not through inheritance or divine selection, but through sheer opportunism. As one of the distant descendants of the Golden lineage, his claim to power was weak compared to Marika's direct children. His insecurity about this inferior status had plagued him throughout his life, driving him to desperate measures to prove his worth. The great rune that came to him amplified his existing obsession with grafting, the practice of surgically attaching body parts from defeated enemies onto himself to gain their strength. What had begun as a disturbing but manageable compulsion became an all-consuming hunger. The rune transformed his castle, Stormvale, into a charnel house where prisoners and volunteers alike were subjected to procedures that violated every principle of mercy and dignity. But here's what's truly tragic about Godrick. The more he grafted, the more monstrous he became, the less his claim to legitimate authority could be taken seriously. He was trapped in a vicious cycle where the very methods he used to gain power undermined his ability to wield it effectively. By the time he had grafted dozens of limbs onto his body, he had transformed from a prince into a grotesque spider-like creature that inspired horror rather than loyalty. Radahn's great rune, by contrast, enhanced qualities that were already noble. His physical strength, already legendary, increased to the point where he became known as the mightiest warrior among the demigods. His gravitational magic, which he had originally developed to avoid crushing his beloved horse Leonard, now allowed him to hold back the very stars themselves, a feat of such magnitude that it defied comprehension. But Radahn's rune also bound him more tightly to his role as protector. The constant vigilance required to maintain his gravitational hold on the stars left him with little mental energy for political maneuvering or strategic planning. He became increasingly isolated, spending long hours in solitary meditation as he struggled to maintain the cosmic barriers protecting the world from stellar catastrophes. This isolation made Radahn vulnerable in ways that pure physical strength couldn't overcome. While other demigods were forging alliances and building power bases, he remained at his post in Caelid, dutifully maintaining his cosmic vigil. His nobility became his weakness. He couldn't abandon his protective duties to pursue political power, which meant he couldn't effectively counter the machinations of rivals who had no such scruples. Malenia's great rune was perhaps the most double-edged of all. It granted her enhanced healing abilities and made her virtually unbeatable in single combat. Her technique, the waterfowl dance, became legendary as a sword art that could cut down entire formations of enemies in seconds. But the rune was corrupted by her affliction with scarlet rot, making it a source of both power and catastrophic danger. The rot that plagued Malenia had always been contained by the unalloyed gold needles her brother Miquella crafted for her. But the great rune's power interfered with these safeguards, making her control over the disease increasingly tenuous. Every battle she fought carried the risk of triggering a scarlet bloom, a massive release of rot that would transform the entire battlefield into a hellscape of disease and decay. This made Malenia, simultaneously, the most powerful military asset and the most dangerous weapon in the entire conflict. Her enemies feared her not just because she might defeat them in battle, but because her very presence could render entire regions uninhabitable for generations. Her allies had to weigh the advantages of her support against the catastrophic risks of deploying her. Rykard's great rune fed into his growing obsession with forbidden knowledge and blasphemous power. As praetor of the Golden Order, he had once been known for fairness and integrity, but his studies into the true nature of cosmic law had led him down darker paths, and the great rune accelerated this descent into corruption. The rune enhanced his ability to consume and assimilate power from other beings, a trait that would eventually lead to his fusion with the god-devouring serpent. At Mint Gelmir, Rykard established a court that welcomed all those who had been cast out or rejected by the Golden Order. Criminals, heretics, dissidents, all found refuge in the Volcano Manor, united by their shared resentment of the system that had failed them. But Rykard's fellowship was built on negative foundations. His followers were united by what they opposed rather than what they hoped to build. The blasphemous experiments conducted in his volcanic fortress pushed the boundaries of acceptable knowledge far beyond anything attempted during the Golden Order's reign. The power he gained came at the cost of his humanity, transforming him into something that could no longer be considered either god or mortal. Mohg's great rune empowered his blood magic and strengthened his connection to the Formless Mother, the outer god he had discovered in the depths beneath the lands between. Where the surface world operated according to the greater will's principles of order and hierarchy, Mohg's underground realm embraced chaos and transformation. The blood rituals that sustained Mohg's dynasty required constant sacrifice and suffering, creating a system that could only expand through conquest and enslavement. Every victory made his forces stronger as they consumed the blood of the defeated, but this advantage came at the cost of making his followers increasingly inhuman with each atrocity they committed. Mohg's obsession with his half-brother Miquella drove much of his strategy during the Shattering. He saw in the eternally youthful demigod a kindred spirit, another being trapped by circumstances beyond his control. His plan to force Miquella into godhood so they could rule together as consorts revealed the depth of his isolation and his desperate desire for meaningful connection. But the methods he employed to achieve this goal ensured that any relationship built upon them would be fundamentally twisted and unsustainable. Morgott's great rune reinforced his tragic loyalty to the Golden Order and his mother, Queen Marika. Despite being born as an omen and rejected by the very system he served, the rune strengthened his ability to defend Lendel and protect the throne from all claimants, including his own siblings. Morgott's situation was uniquely heartbreaking. He possessed the power to seize the throne for himself, backed by the legitimacy of his great rune and his position as defender of the capital. But he never seriously considered claiming rulership because he believed, with absolute conviction, that his omen nature made him unworthy. He fought to preserve a system that viewed his very existence as an abomination. Defending a throne he believed he had no right to occupy. This self-imposed limitation made Morgott a formidable defender, but a poor strategist for long-term survival. He couldn't build alliances because he refused to negotiate with those he viewed as traitors to the Golden Order. He couldn't adapt to changing circumstances because he remained committed to defending institutions that had already been discredited by their failures. His nobility ensured he would eventually be overwhelmed by enemies less constrained by principle. The most complicated situation involved Ranni, who had deliberately orchestrated her own death during the Night of Black Knives specifically to avoid receiving a great rune. She understood that accepting such power would bind her to the same cosmic forces she was trying to escape. Her rejection of the rune that should have been hers was both a philosophical statement and a practical necessity. Instead, Ranni operated through proxies and manipulated events from the shadows, inhabiting a doll crafted in the image of her mentor. Her goal wasn't to claim the throne for herself, but to create an age of stars, where the lands between would be free from the influence of all outer gods, including the greater will. This made her simultaneously less dangerous in immediate military terms, but far more threatening to the cosmic order itself. The distribution of great runes created a situation where no single demigod possessed enough power to dominate all the others, but each had sufficient strength to prevent any rival from achieving total victory. It was a perfect recipe for prolonged conflict. Multiple parties with roughly equivalent power, all convinced of their own righteousness, none willing to submit to the authority of the others. As the initial shock of the Elden Ring's destruction wore off, the demigods began to realize that they were now locked into a struggle that could only be resolved through force. The bonds of family that had once provided some limitation on conflict were dissolving rapidly, replaced by bitter rivalries and ancient grievances that surfaced now that central authority had collapsed. Regional governors and military commanders found themselves forced to choose sides, often based more on immediate survival needs than any deep ideological commitment. The complex web of alliances and rivalries that emerged bore little resemblance to the clear hierarchies of the Golden Age. Former allies became enemies, sworn enemies found themselves cooperating against common threats, and the political landscape shifted with bewildering rapidity. The common people watched these developments with growing dread. They understood, even if they couldn't articulate it clearly, that the conflicts brewing among the demigods would not be resolved through diplomatic negotiation or peaceful compromise.
Topping Rolliger lays at the conflict's brows, at your cell, Condes, will levy for a wall. Alopigraph still blows, was so flawnal, or the DC, or works, was so cruz, or sea facings.
The great runes had unleashed ambitions and hungers that could only be satisfied through violence on a scale the lands between had not seen since the original wars of conquest. The stage was set for open warfare. The pieces were in position, and as the first armies began to march and the first battles were fought, it became clear that the Shattering would live up to its name in the most terrible way possible. The transition from political crisis to open warfare wasn't marked by any single declaration or dramatic moment. Instead, it emerged through a series of escalating provocations and responses that gradually crossed the line from diplomatic maneuvering to military action. The demigods, each empowered by their great runes and driven by ambitions that grew more grandiose with each passing day, found themselves unable to coexist within any framework of shared governance. The first major conflict erupted over Limgrave, the region that served as the gateway to Lendel. Godrick, from his stronghold at Stormvale Castle, attempted to assert control over the territory by claiming that his descent from the Golden lineage gave him authority over all who entered the capital's approaches. This was a transparently opportunistic move. His claim to the lineage was distant at best, but it provided the pretext he needed to begin intercepting travelers and conscripting them for his grafting experiments. The scale of Godrick's atrocities became apparent when refugees began flooding out of Limgrave with stories of prisoners being subjected to surgical horrors. Entire families had been separated, with the strongest members taken to Stormvale while the rest were left to starve. The few who escaped the castle described chambers filled with the screams of those being grafted, halls lined with body parts preserved for future use, and a throne room where Godrick himself sat as an ever-growing mass of stolen limbs and organs. Morgott's response to these reports demonstrated the complexity of his position. As defender of Lindell and the Golden Order's principles, he couldn't ignore such blatant violations of basic decency. But as someone who'd always been labeled a monster himself due to his own nature, he couldn't help but see in Godrick's grotesque transformation a dark mirror of his own rejected status. Still, duty demanded action. The first assault on Stormvale Castle was intended as a punitive expedition rather than a siege, a show of force meant to bring Godrick to heel. Morgott led the attack personally, disguised as Morgott the Felloman to hide his royal identity. The battle that ensued revealed how thoroughly the Great Runes had transformed combat among demigods. Godrick's grafted enhancements gave him strength and resilience far beyond what his original body had possessed. He wielded multiple weapons simultaneously, attacked from unexpected angles, and regenerated from wounds that would have been fatal to any normal being. But his greatest weapon was psychological. The sight of the spider-like creature he had become, combined with knowledge of how he had achieved that form, broke the morale of attacking forces in ways that conventional military tactics couldn't address. Morgott eventually forced Godrick to retreat deeper into Stormvale, but couldn't achieve complete victory. The castle's defenses were too strong, and Godrick's grafted soldiers fought with the desperate ferocity of those who knew they would be shown no mercy if captured. The assault ended in stalemate, with Morgott's forces withdrawing after inflicting significant casualties but failing to capture or kill their target. This first major engagement set the pattern for much of what would follow. Battles between demigods rarely resulted in decisive victories because each possessed enough power to avoid total defeat even when outmatched. Instead, conflicts became grinding wars of attrition, where the real casualties were the ordinary soldiers and civilians caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, in Aeonia, a different kind of conflict was brewing. The Academy of Raya Lucaria, once allied with the Golden Order through the marriage of Radahn and Rennala, found itself in a state of philosophical crisis following the Shattering. The sorcerers who had always chafed under Golden Order restrictions now saw an opportunity to pursue their studies without interference. But the Academy itself was divided. Some scholars argued for neutrality, viewing the demigods' war as a temporary disruption that would eventually resolve itself. Others saw in the chaos an opportunity to expand Aeonia's influence. And a few, inspired by Ranni's example, began to question whether the entire cosmic order deserved to be preserved or should be allowed to collapse entirely. The political intrigue within the Academy eventually erupted into violence when a faction supporting Ranni attempted to seize control of the institution. The magical combat that ensued transformed sections of the Academy into hazardous zones where reality itself behaved unpredictably. Entire wings were sealed off after scholars' experiments went catastrophically wrong, creating permanent magical anomalies. Rennala herself, still traumatized by Radagon's abandonment when he left her to become Marika's second Elden Lord, retreated into increasingly delusional obsession with the amber egg he had given her. She spent her days attempting to perform rebirth rituals, trying to recapture the happiness of her earlier life through increasingly desperate magical experiments. Her effective abdication of leadership left the Academy rudderless at the worst possible time. The conflict in Aeonia was further complicated by Radahn's presence in neighboring Caelid. While he remained largely focused on his cosmic vigil, his forces occasionally ventured into Aeonia to secure resources or pursue strategic objectives. These incursions brought them into conflict with Academy forces, creating a three-way struggle between Ranni's agents, Radahn's loyalists, and the Academy's neutralist faction. In the underground depths beneath Caelid, Mohg was conducting his own campaigns according to entirely different principles than the surface conflicts. The Blood Dynasty's expansion through the tunnel systems was brutal and systematic. Communities that submitted to Mohg's rule were incorporated into his blood cult, while those that resisted were destroyed utterly. The blood magic that sustained Mohg's forces created military capabilities that conventional armies couldn't match. Warriors who gained power through consuming the blood of their enemies became stronger with each victory, creating a positive feedback loop. The most devoted cultists underwent transformations that enhanced their combat abilities while making them increasingly inhuman in appearance and behavior. The dynasty's recruitment drives were remarkably effective among populations that had been abandoned by the surface world's authorities. Mohg offered power, purpose, and belonging to those whom the Golden Order had rejected. Omen, criminals, outcasts of all kinds found welcome in his court. The price was participation in blood rituals that violated every moral principle they had been taught, but for many, this seemed a small price to pay for finally being valued rather than revealed. The underground war between Mohg's dynasty and Rykard's followers created a hidden front in the Shattering that most surface observers never knew existed. The two factions competed for control of the same tunnel systems and underground settlements, leading to battles fought in darkness and confined spaces where the most horrific weapons proved most effective. Rykard's forces employed serpent-themed magic and blasphemous techniques drawn from his forbidden research. They could transform defeated enemies into serpentine creatures under their control, creating armies that grew stronger with each engagement. The psychological impact of fighting former comrades who had been turned into monsters was as effective as any conventional weapon. The civilian populations caught between these underground factions faced impossible choices. Both Mohg and Rykard offered protection and power, but at costs that would have been unthinkable during the Golden Age. The trauma inflicted on these communities created wounds that would persist long after the physical damage of war had been repaired. On the surface, Malenia and Miquella's faction operated according to different principles entirely. The Halig tree, which Miquella had cultivated as an alternative to the corrupted Erd tree, represented an attempt to create a haven for those whom the Golden Order had rejected or failed. Omen, Albinorix, and others who lacked grace found welcome there. Miquella's vision was genuinely compassionate. He sought to create a world free from the arbitrary cruelties and hypocrisies that marked Golden Order rule. His unalloyed gold technology, which could halt the progression of outer god corruption, represented a breakthrough that could have saved countless lives if widely distributed. His followers operated under rules of engagement that prioritized civilian protection and minimized unnecessary casualties. But Miquella's very virtues made him a target. His inability to defend himself physically despite his divine nature, made him dependent upon Malenia and his other followers for protection. This dependency created vulnerabilities that enemies could exploit. More importantly, his compassionate approach was incompatible with the brutal reality of the Shattering. Mercy and restraint became liabilities when facing opponents who showed neither. Malenia served as the sword arm of Miquella's vision, but their relationship created its own problems. Her devotion to her brother was absolute. She saw in him the embodiment of everything the world could become under enlightened leadership. But her methods often contradicted his message. The Cleanrot Knights, who served under her command, were fiercely loyal and highly effective, but the Scarlet Rot that gave them their name also represented a constant threat. The strategic situation that developed during the first year of open warfare was characterized by multiple fronts and shifting alliances. No demigod possessed enough power to dominate all others, but each had sufficient strength to prevent rivals from achieving total victory. The result was a complex web of conflicts, where yesterday's enemy might become today's ally against a common threat, only to return to hostility tomorrow. Logistical challenges made sustained campaigns difficult. The breakdown of trade networks and the conversion of agricultural land into battlefields created resource shortages affecting all factions. Each developed its own solutions to these problems, solutions that often reflected their leaders' moral characters as much as strategic thinking. Morgott's forces maintained disciplined supply systems inherited from the old Golden Order military, but this approach limited their operational flexibility. Godrick's armies simply took what they needed from conquered territories. Mohg's blood cult developed the most sinister solution by incorporating cannibalism into standard procedures. The differences in logistics revealed fundamental differences in values and methods. Naval warfare opened new theaters of conflict as factions sought control of waterways connecting different regions. The Academy's floating platforms and energy weapons gave them significant advantages in naval combat, transforming Aeonia's lakes into contested zones. In tempos get nastig the foes, wewes sinchutame, chewas, into joes, into contested zones, into inolest, into contested zones. The magical contamination resulting from these battles made large areas of water unusable, forcing mass population movements. As the first year of warfare drew to a close, it became apparent that the conflict would not be resolved quickly. The Great Runes prevented any single demigod from accumulating enough power to dominate, creating a strategic stalemate. But the level of destruction was escalating with each engagement, and the restraints that had previously limited violence were dissolving rapidly. The stage was set for the next phase of the Shattering, where the conflicts that had begun with familiar patterns of siege and battle would evolve into something far more terrible, as each side sought new ways to break the stalemate. The third year of the Shattering would be remembered as the time when the conflict transformed from a war between armies into a catastrophe, threatening the very habitability of the lands between. The escalation that had been building finally reached its breaking point when the two mightiest warriors among the demigods met in single combat on the plains of Caelid. The events leading to the Battle of Aeonia began not with Miquella's kidnapping. That would come later, but with the escalating conflicts of the Shattering itself. The reasons why Malenia marched her Cleanrot Knights to Caelid remain debated. Some evidence suggests Miquella may have made a vow with Radahn, asking him to be his consort when Miquella ascended to godhood. If Radahn later refused to honor this vow, it could explain why Malenia sought him out. Other possibilities exist. Radahn's growing power and his assault on Lendel during the first defense demonstrated his ambition to become Elden Lord. This could have been perceived as a threat to Miquella's own plans for ascending to godhood. Whatever the true reason, Malenia's army marched to Caelid, and the two mightiest demigods prepared for confrontation. Radahn's initial response was characteristically noble. Witnesses to the battle describe how he sought to minimize collateral damage while protecting his realm. His gravitational magic created barriers and redirected attacks rather than focusing solely on destruction. But Malenia's forces weren't conducting a conventional campaign. They were there for Radahn specifically. The personal confrontation between Malenia and Radahn was triggered by a relatively minor incident, but it represented the culmination of tensions building since their forces first encountered each other. Both demigods understood that their reputations and their factions' credibility were now at stake in ways that made backing down impossible. The duel that decided the Battle of Aeonia was unlike any confrontation that had occurred during previous phases of the Shattering. Both participants possessed power operating on cosmic scales, making their clash as much a force of nature as a military engagement. The ground beneath their feet was reshaped by energies they released. The air itself became difficult to breathe due to magical forces filling it. Radahn's gravitational magic gave him advantages that should have been decisive. He could manipulate the battlefield itself, increasing his own effective mass, while reducing that of his enemies. His ability to redirect projectiles and area effect attacks made him nearly invulnerable to conventional assault. His sheer physical strength, enhanced by his great rune, allowed him to wield weapons that would have required entire teams to lift. But Malenia's combat style was specifically designed to overcome the kinds of defenses Radahn employed. Her incredible speed and precision allowed her to exploit momentary gaps in his gravitational barriers. Her technique, the waterfowl dance, was a flowing sequence of strikes so rapid that it seemed to defy physics, each movement perfectly calculated to find openings in even the most perfect defense. Moreover, Malenia possessed supernatural healing abilities that meant she could sustain damage that would have been fatal to any other opponent. Wounds that would have ended the fight closed within moments. Limbs that should have been severed remained functional. She could afford to trade blow for blow in ways that made Radahn's superior strength less decisive than it appeared. The duel raged for hours, with neither combatant able to achieve decisive advantage. Radahn's power was immense, but Malenia's skill and regeneration allowed her to weather his attacks. Her strikes were devastating, but Radahn's gravitational defenses prevented most from landing with full force. It was the classic matchup. Overwhelming power against perfect technique, immortal endurance against immovable defense. The turning point came when Malenia's unalloyed gold needle was finally overwhelmed by the strain of containing her affliction during such intense combat. The scarlet rot that had been building within her for years was suddenly released in a massive bloom that transformed the entire battlefield. The scarlet Aeonia that bloomed from Malenia's body wasn't merely a weapon. It was a fundamental transformation of natural order. The rot spread outward from the blooming point, converting everything it touched into extensions of itself. Plants withered and mutated. Animals died screaming as their flesh liquefied. The soil itself became toxic, unable to support normal life. And worst of all, the rot was self-perpetuating. It didn't just kill, it transformed death into a vector for further spread. The corpses of the fallen became breeding grounds for rot-infected life forms. The water became contaminated, carrying the disease to regions far from the original battlefield. The air itself became dangerous to breathe for extended periods. Radahn's response to the scarlet bloom demonstrated both his incredible resilience and the limitations of even divine power when confronted with forces operating according to alien principles. His gravitational magic could deflect physical attacks and redirect energy weapons, but it provided no protection against a disease infecting the very air and soil around him. The sight of the mightiest warrior, among the demigods, being slowly consumed by scarlet rot created psychological trauma among witnesses that went far beyond immediate military implications. The realization that even Radahn could be brought low by forces beyond his control shattered assumptions about the nature of power and invincibility that had sustained many throughout earlier phases of the war. As the rot took hold, something fundamental broke within Radahn's mind. The constant strain of maintaining his cosmic barriers while fighting for his life, combined with the invasive nature of the disease corrupting his flesh, pushed him beyond the limits of sanity. The noble warrior who had held back the stars themselves was reduced to a mindless beast driven only by hunger and rage. Malenia herself collapsed after the bloom, falling into a comatose state from which she would not wake. The release of so much accumulated rot had drained her completely, leaving her as much a casualty of the battle as Radahn. Her clean rot knights carried her unconscious form back to the Haligtree, where she would remain in deep sleep, her mission to find Miquella incomplete. The mutual destruction that resulted from the Battle of Aeonia represented the worst possible outcome for both sides. Malenia's forces achieved no meaningful strategic objectives while losing their leader. Radahn's army was left without effective command while their general transformed into a mad beast that eventually had to be contained on the battlefield itself, endlessly wandering the rot-scarred wasteland while consuming the corpses of the fallen. But the true catastrophe extended far beyond the immediate casualties. The environmental consequences of the scarlet bloom spread through Caelid's ecosystem in ways that threatened to make the entire region uninhabitable for generations, if not permanently. Plants that had never been exposed to such corruption began to mutate in grotesque ways. Trees developed cancerous growths that wept infectious fluids. Grass transformed into sharp, needle-like structures that pierced flesh and injected spores. Flowers bloomed in unnatural colors, releasing pollen that induced madness in those who inhaled it. Animals fared even worse. Those that didn't die immediately from exposure underwent transformations that turned them into monsters bearing only superficial resemblance to their original forms. Dogs grew to monstrous sizes and developed rows of fangs. Crows mutated into creatures with multiple heads and eyes. Even insects grew to enormous proportions, becoming apex predators in the transformed ecosystem. Most disturbing were the new forms of life that emerged from the corrupted landscape, creatures that were neither wholly natural nor entirely artificial, but represented something alien to the normal patterns of existence. Giant rot-infected flowers developed a form of predatory intelligence. Fungal masses achieved mobility and began hunting living prey. The rot didn't just kill, it created. The transformation of Caelid from a thriving region into the festering wasteland, it would remain served as a stark demonstration of what the shattering was costing the lands between. The pursuit of political objectives through magical warfare was literally destroying the world that various factions claimed they wanted to rule. The human cost was equally staggering. Refugees fleeing the affected regions brought the rot with them, spreading contamination to new areas while straining resources in communities already struggling to cope with the ongoing war. Medical and magical healing systems were overwhelmed. Many who might have been saved died from diseases that had previously been easily treatable. The psychological impact of the Caelid catastrophe reached every corner of the lands between as reports of the devastation spread. The realization that the demigods' conflicts could create permanent damage on such a scale led many to question whether any of them deserved to inherit the throne they were fighting over. Religious authorities who had previously supported various factions began questioning whether the shattering represented divine will or cosmic catastrophe. The corruption of Caelid, a region blessed by the Erd Tree for centuries, seemed to contradict fundamental assumptions upon which Golden Order theology was based. If the gods themselves could inflict such destruction, what did that say about their fitness to rule? The economic impact of losing Caelid as a productive region created shortages and supply disruptions affecting all remaining factions. Trade routes connecting different parts of the lands between were severed. Agricultural and mineral resources the region had provided were no longer available to support military operations or civilian needs. The magical contamination created areas where normal spellcasting became unpredictable or impossible. Fundamental laws governing magical energy were warped by alien corruption, making it dangerous for practitioners to employ techniques that had previously been reliable and safe. Entire schools of magic became unusable in contaminated zones. As news of the catastrophe spread beyond the lands between, it began affecting the realm's relationships with neighboring territories and distant trading partners. The reputation for stability and prosperity that had made the Golden Order an attractive ally was replaced by an image of a failed state whose internal conflicts threatened to spread chaos to surrounding regions. The Festival of Radahn, which would eventually be organized to grant the mad demigod mercy through honorable death, represented one of the few collaborative efforts undertaken by warring parties during the entire conflict. The recognition that Radahn's continued existence as a mindless beast served no one's interests brought temporary cooperation. But it also demonstrated how thoroughly the shattering had degraded even the mightiest of the demigods. The long-term implications of the Caelid catastrophe wouldn't become fully apparent until years later, but it was already clear that the shattering had crossed a threshold from which there could be no return to pre-war status quo. The world that would emerge from the conflict, regardless of who ultimately claimed victory, would be fundamentally different from the one that had existed during the Golden Age. The Battle of Aeonia served as a turning point. The moment when all participants realized that the war they were fighting might destroy everything they were fighting for. Yet the Great Rune's corrupting influence, combined with the psychological inability of the demigods to accept defeat, meant that even this terrible revelation wasn't enough to bring about peace. If anything, the catastrophe hardened positions. Each faction blamed rivals for forcing them into such extreme measures. Each claimed that their opponent's willingness to risk such destruction proved that they were unfit to rule. The cycle of violence and recrimination continued, driving the Shattering toward its final, desperate phase. As the Shattering entered its fourth and final year, the nature of the conflict had fundamentally changed. The mutual destruction of Malenia and Radahn eliminated two of the most powerful military forces, while demonstrating that continued escalation threatened to make the entire lands between uninhabitable. Yet the remaining demigods, driven by the corrupting influence of their great runes, continued pursuing their ambitions even as the world crumbled around them. Leyndell, the royal capital, became the focal point of the war's final phase, with Marika imprisoned within the Erd Tree and the Golden Order's authority in collapse. Whoever controlled Leyndell could claim at least symbolic legitimacy as the rightful ruler. More practically, the capital contained resources, defensive fortifications, and strategic position that made it the most valuable prize in the entire lands between. Morgott had defended the city throughout the war with a determination that bordered on obsession. His absolute conviction that the Golden Order represented the best hope for peace and stability despite being born as an omen that the system rejected gave him psychological advantages his more conflicted opponents lacked. But years of siege and isolation were beginning to show their effects. The breakdown of supply lines and trade networks meant that even the capital's extensive stockpiles were running low on essential commodities. The rationing systems Morgott implemented to manage these shortages created social tensions, while failing to address underlying problems making shortages inevitable. The black market flourished as those with resources hoarded them against an increasingly uncertain future. Religious crisis developed within Leyndell as reports of various atrocities reached the capital. Morgott's absolute faith in the Golden Order made it impossible for him to acknowledge that the system he defended might be fundamentally flawed. His status as an omen made it difficult for him to serve as credible spokesperson for orthodox religious values. The contradiction between his loyalty and his rejected nature created cognitive dissonance among those he sought to lead. Prophecies and omens began manifesting throughout the capital with increasing frequency, strange phenomena that spoke of cosmic judgment and divine abandonment in language that couldn't be dismissed as mere superstition. The appearance of unusual lights in the sky above Leyndell, combined with increasing frequency of supernatural events within the city itself, created an atmosphere of impending doom affecting both military effectiveness and civilian morale. The final siege of Leyndell, when it came, wasn't the result of any coordinated strategy by remaining rebel factions, but rather the inevitable consequence of the capital's isolation and the breakdown of all other sources of authority. The various forces that converged on the city represented less an army than a collection of desperate groups seeking whatever resources or salvation they could find. Godrick's forces approached from Limgrave, reduced in number and morale by years of attrition, but still dangerous due to their grafted enhancements. The remaining soldiers were those too corrupted or too desperate to abandon their master, creating a military force more notable for its horror than its effectiveness. They fought with the desperation of those who knew they would be shown no mercy if defeated. Rykard's followers advanced from Mid-Gelmir, employing serpent-themed magic and blasphemous techniques, drawn from forbidden research. Their forces included transformed creatures that had once been human, along with cultists who had willingly embraced corruption in exchange for power. Their presence on the battlefield created psychological weapons as effective as any conventional arms. The sight of former allies serving as serpentine abominations broke morale among defending forces. From the underground depths came Mohg's blood cultists, emerging from tunnel systems that connected to Leyndell's foundations. Their appearance within the city itself created panic among civilians who had thought themselves safe behind massive walls. The blood magic these warriors employed made them stronger with each enemy they killed, creating positive feedback loops that made them increasingly dangerous as battles progressed. Even Ranni's agents participated, though their objectives differed from those of other factions. Rather than seeking to claim the throne for themselves, they worked to prevent any other faction from establishing control, while advancing their mistress's agenda of freeing the lands between from all outer gods' influence. Their use of spirit summoning and magical sabotage created chaos that served multiple purposes simultaneously. Morgott's defense of the capital demonstrated military genius that surprised even those who had known him for decades. His intimate knowledge of Lendel's fortifications, combined with his ability to coordinate various defensive systems built up over centuries, allowed him to maximize advantages that defensive warfare provided. The walls that had protected the capital for generations proved their worth as attackers broke themselves against stone and steel. But Morgott's greatest asset was his absolute conviction in the righteousness of his cause. While other commanders might have been demoralized by the overwhelming odds or tempted to negotiate favorable surrender terms, Morgott never wavered. Every street became a battlefield, every building a fortress. The defenders fought with the ferocity of those protecting not just a city but an ideal, the last bastion of order in a world descending into chaos. The use of Erdtree avatars as defensive forces marked one of the most significant developments of the siege. These massive tree spirits, which had previously served only as guardians of minor Erdtrees, were somehow compelled or convinced to defend Leyndell itself. Their appearance on the battlefield created terror among attackers, while reinforcing defenders' conviction that they fought for the Erdtree's will. The street-by-street fighting that characterized the siege was brutal beyond description. Magical combat in urban environments created collateral damage that destroyed irreplaceable cultural treasures and architectural marvels. Ancient libraries burned, their contents lost forever. Temples were desecrated as they became military strongpoints. Artworks that had survived centuries were smashed in moments of combat. Civilian casualties mounted as the city became one vast battlefield. Those who hadn't fled before the siege found themselves trapped between warring armies, their homes destroyed, their lives forfeit to forces beyond their control. The humanitarian crisis overwhelmed any attempt at organized response. The wounded died for lack of treatment. The hungry starved despite food stores existing elsewhere in the city. Children were orphaned by the thousands. Morgott himself fought with a fury that belied his defensive strategy. Wielding his cursed sword and holy magic in equal measure, he personally led counterattacks that drove invaders from key positions. His mastery of both omen curses and Golden Order incantations made him a formidable opponent even for other demigods. But the strain of maintaining both his military command and his combat effectiveness was beginning to tell. The psychological warfare employed by all sides reached new depths of cruelty. Godrick's forces displayed the grafted remains of captured defenders to break morale. Mohg's cultists performed blood rituals visible from the walls, sacrificing prisoners to power their magic. Rykard's serpent men howled in voices that were almost human, calling out the names of those they had once been before their transformation. The turning point came not through any brilliant tactical maneuver or decisive battle, but through simple exhaustion. The defenders had been holding against overwhelming odds for too long, sustaining casualties they couldn't replace, consuming resources they couldn't replenish. The inevitable mathematics of attrition warfare ground down even the most determined resistance. When the outer walls were finally breached, the fighting moved into the city's interior districts. The royal capital, which had seemed impregnable from without, proved vulnerable to enemies within its walls. The tunnel systems that Mohg's forces used gave them access to areas that should have been secure. Ranni's agents sabotaged critical infrastructure at crucial moments. The coordination between different attacking factions, though imperfect, was sufficient to prevent Morgott from concentrating his forces effectively. Morgott's last stand took place at the base of the Erdtree itself, defending the approach to the throne room where Marika remained imprisoned. Wounded, exhausted, his forces scattered or slain, he nevertheless refused to yield. His final words before falling demonstrated the tragic nobility that had characterized his entire life, expressing regret, not for his own fate, but for his failure to protect the order he had served so faithfully. The fall of Leyndell marked the effective end of the Golden Order as a functioning governmental system. The throne that had been the prize everyone sought was revealed as empty, a symbol without substance, authority without power. Marika remained imprisoned within the Erdtree, unreachable even to those who had conquered her capital. The victory that so many had fought for proved hollow. In the aftermath of Leyndell's fall, the various factions that had cooperated in its conquest immediately turned on each other. The temporary alliances dissolved as each sought to claim whatever advantage they could from the ruins. The fighting that had destroyed the outer city moved into the inner districts, completing the devastation. The royal capital, that had once been the crown jewel of the lands between, was reduced to ruins. Its streets were choked with rubble and corpses. Its great buildings stood as hollow shells, their interiors gutted by fire and combat. The fountains that had once flowed with blessed water ran dry or carried contaminated runoff. The very stones seemed to weep for what had been lost. Yet even this catastrophe, the fall of the capital itself, wasn't enough to end the shattering. The demigods who survived retreated to their strongholds, still possessing their great runes, still convinced of their right to rule. The difference was that now there was almost nothing left to rule, just ruins and refugees, wastelands and weapons that could destroy but not create. The stage was set for the final phase of the shattering, not a climactic battle or decisive confrontation, but a slow descent into exhaustion and abandonment, as even the gods themselves gave up on the lands between. The fourth year of the shattering ended not with a bang, but with a whimper, not through any decisive victory or final battle, but simply through the exhaustion of the participants' ability to continue fighting. The surviving demigods remained in their strongholds, still technically at war with each other, but no longer capable of meaningful military action. The silence that settled over the lands between was not the peace of resolution, but the quiet of desolation. What remained after 4 years of divine warfare was almost unrecognizable compared to the golden realm that had existed before. Entire regions had been transformed into wastelands where normal life could not survive. Caelid festered with scarlet rot. The mountaintops of the giants bore scars from battles that had reopened wounds from the ancient war against the fire giants. Even Limgrave, which had seen less intense fighting than some regions, was dotted with ruins and haunted by undead that multiplied unchecked. The environmental damage would take generations to heal if healing was possible at all. The magical contamination created areas where the laws of physics operated according to different rules than those governing the rest of the world. Travelers reported entire valleys where gravity behaved unpredictably, forests where time flowed at different rates, lakes whose waters had properties that violated every principle of chemistry and biology. The transformation of the natural world extended beyond simple destruction. New forms of life emerged in places where intense magical warfare had fundamentally altered the conditions for existence. Some of these creatures were relatively benign, strange, but capable of coexisting with conventional life forms. Others were actively hostile, representing threats that hadn't existed before the shattering. Those who live in death proliferated throughout the realm, spawning from the death root that spread through the Erdtree's corrupted root system. These undead creatures represented a fundamental violation of the natural order, beings trapped between life and death, unable to rest but also unable to truly live. Their existence was a constant reminder of the wound that Godwyn's death had carved into reality itself. The human cost defied calculation. The population of the lands between had been reduced by warfare, disease, and starvation to a fraction of what it had been during the Golden Age. Entire communities had been wiped out, their locations marked only by ruins and graves. Families had been shattered, with survivors scattered across the realm or forced into refugee camps that lacked basic resources. The survivors who remained faced a world that bore little resemblance to the one they had known. The social bonds and cultural institutions that had sustained civilization for centuries were shattered as thoroughly as the Elden Ring itself. Trust between communities had eroded to the point where travel was dangerous, not just from monsters, but from other humans who had been driven to banditry or worse by desperation. The knowledge and wisdom accumulated during the Golden Age was largely lost. Libraries had burned, academies had been destroyed or abandoned, and the scholars who had preserved learning were dead or scattered. The technological and magical innovations that had made the Golden Age's prosperity possible were forgotten or deliberately suppressed by those who viewed them as sources of the very power that had caused so much destruction. The infrastructure supporting civilization had collapsed. Roads and bridges lay in ruins, making travel between regions difficult or impossible. The magical transportation systems that had supplemented conventional travel were too dangerous to use due to cosmic instabilities the shattering had created. Communication networks had broken down, leaving isolated communities with no reliable way to learn what was happening elsewhere. Perhaps most devastating of all was the psychological and spiritual damage inflicted on the survivors. The hope and idealism that had once inspired people to believe in just government and wise leadership had been extinguished by years of witnessing the worst possible expressions of power and ambition. The cynicism and despair that characterized the post-shattering population would prove among the most difficult wounds to heal. Religious faith, which had once provided meaning and structure to people's lives, was in crisis. The Golden Order's promises of eternal life and divine protection had been revealed as empty. The Erd Tree itself stood corrupted, its golden light diminished, its blessings unreliable. Those who still clung to faith found themselves questioning everything they had been taught, while many simply abandoned religion entirely. The Greater Will's response to this catastrophe was telling. It withdrew, not completely. The fundamental cosmic forces it represented still operated, but it ceased to actively involve itself in the affairs of the lands between. The grace that had blessed the faithful became rare and unpredictable. The guidance that had once flowed through the two fingers became cryptic or absent entirely. This divine abandonment gave the period its name, the Age of Abandonment. The gods had given up on the lands between, leaving its inhabitants to face the consequences of their choices without the safety net that had previously protected them from the worst outcomes. It was cosmic tough love, or perhaps simply cosmic indifference. The surviving demigods retreated into their own obsessions and private hells. Godrick remained in Stormvale, a grotesque spider thing, grafting endlessly in a desperate attempt to become worthy of the power he claimed. Rykard had completed his fusion with the god-devouring serpent, becoming a blasphemous entity that consumed all who came to Mentegelmir. Mohg continued his blood rituals in the depths, his dynasty sustained by dwindling numbers of cultists. Ranni remained at the academy, locked in her delusion of rebirth, endlessly performing rituals with the amber egg Radahn had given her. The scholars who remained at Rykard pursued increasingly esoteric and disconnected research, having abandoned any pretense of serving broader societal needs. Knowledge for its own sake became their only goal, divorced from practical application or moral consideration. Malenia slept in her scarlet bloom at the Haligtree's base, her unconscious form guarded by the few cleanrot knights who had survived the Battle of Aeonia. Miquella remained imprisoned in Mohg's cocoon, undergoing transformations that would eventually result in his forced ascension to godhood. The two most compassionate of the demigods had been rendered unable to act, their vision of a better world unrealized. Ranni continued her mysterious work from her tower, manipulating events through proxies and pursuing her goal of freeing the lands between from all outer gods' influence. Of all the demigods, she alone seemed to have a coherent plan for what should come after the shattering, but her methods remained hidden, her ultimate objectives unclear to most who encountered her agents. The power vacuum created by the Golden Order's collapse and the demigods' effective stalemate allowed local strongmen and regional warlords to carve out their own domains. Some of these new rulers were relatively benevolent, genuinely attempting to protect and provide for those under their authority. Others were tyrants who exploited the chaos to establish brutal regimes that rivaled anything the demigods had done. Banditry and piracy flourished as military forces, once dedicated to maintaining order, were disbanded or went rogue. The roads became hunting grounds for those desperate or vicious enough to prey on travelers. Merchant caravans required armed escorts just to move basic goods between settlements. The few ships still operating on the lakes and rivers faced constant threat from raiders. The economy that had sustained trade and prosperity during the Golden Age had collapsed entirely. Currency systems lost the backing of stable governmental authority, becoming worthless paper or metal. Barter replaced commerce in most places, with communities trading surplus goods for necessities they couldn't produce themselves. But even barter required trust and reliable transportation, both scarce commodities in the post-shattering world. Agricultural production had been devastated by warfare, environmental destruction, and labor shortages. Fields lay fallow because there weren't enough farmers to work them, or because the land itself had been contaminated. Irrigation systems had been destroyed or fallen into disrepair. The careful balance of agricultural practices that had sustained large populations was disrupted, leading to famines that killed as many as the war itself had, yet life persisted. Humans are remarkably adaptable, and even in the ruins of civilization, communities found ways to survive. Villages that had been bypassed by the war's worst effects became refuges for survivors. Underground settlements expanded as surface dwellers sought safety from the threats above. New social structures emerged to replace those that had been destroyed. These survivor communities operated according to principles very different from those of the Golden Age. Merit replaced birth as the primary determinant of status. Those who could contribute to survival were valued regardless of their origins. Cooperation replaced hierarchy out of practical necessity. Communities that didn't work together didn't survive. Pragmatism replaced ideology. Abstract principles meant less than securing food and safety. Some of these communities actively rejected any connection to the old order. They saw the Golden Age not as something to be restored, but as the corrupt system that had led to the shattering. Their goal wasn't to rebuild what had been lost, but to create something genuinely new, free from the mistakes and injustices that had characterized Marika's reign. Others clung desperately to fragments of the old ways, maintaining what rituals and traditions they could remember in hopes that someday the Golden Order would be restored. These conservative communities often came into conflict with more progressive neighbors, creating new tensions that threatened to reignite wider conflicts. The question of what should come next divided survivors as thoroughly as the Great Runes had divided the demigods. Should they attempt to restore the Golden Order, learning from its mistakes? Should they embrace one of the alternative visions that Miquella, Ranni, or others had proposed? Or should they abandon divine rule entirely and seek some form of mortal governance? There were no easy answers, and the survivors lacked the resources or unity to implement any coherent plan. The lands between existed in a state of limbo, the old order destroyed but nothing stable emerging to replace it. This uncertainty, this sense of existing in an interregnum between ages, characterized the period following the Shattering's end. And then, after years of divine abandonment, something unexpected happened. The grace began to return, not to those who had always been blessed, but to those who had been cast out. The tarnished, those exiled warriors who had been stripped of grace and banished during Godfrey's reign, began to experience its return for the first time in generations. This wasn't a reward for faithful service. Most of the tarnished had spent their exile engaged in activities that would have been considered barbaric by Golden Order standards. It was a desperate measure by cosmic forces that had exhausted all other options for restoring stability to a broken world. The stage was set for a new chapter in the lands between's history. But before we explore that, we need to understand what the Shattering had taught, and whether those lessons would be learned or ignored. The return of grace to the tarnished represented one of the most significant developments in the entire saga of the lands between. These were the descendants of Godfrey's warriors, those who had been stripped of divine blessing and banished from the realm generations ago. Their exile had been presented as a natural conclusion to their purpose, but many suspected it was actually a calculated move by Marika herself, creating a reserve force that could be called upon if her grand design ever failed. If that was indeed her plan, it demonstrated remarkable foresight. The tarnished who now received Grace's call were hardened by generations of survival in the harsh lands beyond the lands between's borders. They had learned to fight without divine blessing, to survive without the Erdtree's protection, to thrive despite lacking everything the Golden Age had taken for granted. These weren't the pampered nobles and privileged warriors who had fought in the Shattering. They were barbarians, mercenaries, and wanderers who had built their strength through adversity rather than inheritance. They brought with them no attachment to the old order's hierarchies, no investment in maintaining failed systems, no illusions about divine rule's inherent righteousness. The call that drew them back was simple but profound. Rise, tarnished, and be guided by grace to brandish the power of the Elden Ring and become Elden Lord in the lands between. It was both a command and an opportunity, the chance to claim the prize that had eluded even the demigods, to reshape the world according to their own vision. But the lands between they returned to bore little resemblance to the realm their ancestors had been banished from. The golden prosperity was gone, replaced by ruins and wastelands. The clear hierarchies were dissolved into chaos. The divine order was shattered in the most literal sense. What they found was not a kingdom to inherit, but a world to rebuild from rubble. The Tarnished faced challenges that the demigods never had to confront. Without the inherent divine power that came from being Marika's children, they had to grow strong through struggle. Every enemy defeated, every trial overcome, made them more powerful. The runes they collected from fallen foes, the very currency of existence in the lands between, could be used to enhance their abilities in ways that divine birth never allowed. This system of growth through adversity represented a fundamental departure from Golden Age principles. Where the old order had been built on inherited status and predetermined roles, the Tarnished rose through merit and determination. They could choose their own path, develop their own style, pursue their own objectives. The flexibility and agency they possessed stood in stark contrast to the rigid hierarchies that had characterized Marika's reign. The Tarnished also encountered something the demigods had lost: genuine choice about the future. As they collected great runes from the surviving demigods and grew in power, they gained the ability not just to become Elden Lord, but to determine what that title would mean. They could choose to restore the Golden Order, establish an entirely new cosmic framework, or even reject divine rule altogether. This agency was both a blessing and a burden. The weight of deciding the fate of an entire world rested on shoulders of individuals who had been outcasts and exiles. They had no divine mandate, no clear guidance about what should come next. The Two Fingers provided cryptic direction, but their agenda was suspect given their connection to the greater will, the very entity whose order had failed so catastrophically. The Tarnished encountered the surviving demigods as both obstacles and potential allies. Godrick the Grafted lurked in Stormvale, a mandatory challenge for any seeking to reach Lendel. His defeat was almost inevitable. He was the weakest of the demigods even with his grafting, and his madness had long since consumed any tactical brilliance he might once have possessed. Ranni at the Academy represented a different kind of challenge. Lost in her delusion of rebirth, she was more tragic than threatening, yet her mastery of sorcery and the protective magic surrounding her remained formidable. Those Tarnished who defeated her often felt pity rather than triumph. She was a victim of the Shattering as much as its perpetrator. Radahn, the Starscourge reduced to a mindless beast, required the combined efforts of multiple warriors to defeat during the festival organized in his honor. His death was a mercy, releasing him from torment while also releasing the stars he had held back for so long. The meteors that fell after his defeat brought both destruction and opportunity, opening paths that had been closed for years. Rykard at Midgelmir presented perhaps the most clear-cut moral choice. His embrace of blasphemy and transformation into the god-devouring serpent left little room for nuance. He had to be destroyed for the safety of all. Yet even his defeat raised questions. Was destroying him justice or simply eliminating competition? Were the Tarnished any better than the demigods they slew? Mohg in his underground palace required Tarnished to descend into literal and metaphorical darkness. His blood magic and the arena he controlled created one of the most challenging confrontations any Tarnished would face. His defeat freed Miquella from the cocoon, though whether this was ultimately a blessing remained unclear. Malenia, waiting in her scarlet bloom at the Haligtree's base, represented the ultimate test of martial prowess. Her waterfowl dance and devastating scarlet Aeonia made her perhaps the single most difficult opponent any Tarnished could face. Those few who managed to defeat her did so through skill, determination, and often sheer stubbornness traits that defined the tarnished experience. Morgott's encounter was particularly poignant. When finally revealed as the true identity of Margit the Fell Omen, his tragic loyalty became apparent. His final words expressed not hatred for the tarnished, but regret for his own failure to protect the order he served. His defeat was necessary, but felt less like triumph than tragedy. The last defender of a failed system dying in service to ideals that no longer served anyone. The journey to collect the Great Runes and gain audience with Marika within the Erdtree required Tarnished to traverse the entire lands between. In doing so, they witnessed firsthand the full scope of what the Shattering had destroyed. They encountered survivor communities struggling to rebuild. They fought through ruins of once great cities. They navigated wastelands where civilization had collapsed entirely. This comprehensive tour of devastation served an important purpose. It ensured that any Tarnished who ultimately claimed the throne would understand the cost of the demigods' conflict. They couldn't remain detached or ignorant of the suffering their decisions might cause. They had to confront the consequences of divine warfare in the most direct way possible. The Tarnished also encountered various factions and individuals who had their own ideas about the future. Fear, the deathbed companion, sought to establish an order where those who live in death would be accepted rather than persecuted. The Dung Eater pursued a vision where everyone would be cursed with the Omen affliction, creating equality through shared suffering. The frenzied flame offered to burn it all away, reducing the world to primordial chaos from which something new might eventually emerge. Even Ranni presented her alternative, the Age of Stars, where the lands between would be freed from all outer gods' influence, allowing inhabitants to chart their own destiny without divine interference. Her path required the Tarnished to essentially become her consort, binding themselves to her vision and her goals. Each of these options represented a fundamentally different answer to the question of what should come after the Shattering. Each had its own logic, its own appeal, its own terrible costs. The choice wasn't between obvious good and obvious evil, but between competing visions of what the world should become. The Tarnished's ultimate decision, which ending they pursued, would determine not just who ruled, but the very nature of reality in the lands between. Would they restore the Golden Order, learning from its mistakes? Would they establish a new order based on different principles? Would they free the world from divine rule entirely? Or would they burn it all down and start from absolute zero? This agency, this power to choose, represented something unprecedented in the lands between's history. For the first time, the future wouldn't be determined by gods or demigods, but by mortal will and mortal choice. The Tarnished, those exiled outcasts who had been stripped of grace and cast out, now held the fate of the world in their hands. Whether they would prove wiser than the gods and demigods who had preceded them remained to be seen, but their very existence represented hope. The possibility that the cycle of divine tyranny and catastrophic rebellion could be broken, that something better could emerge from the ashes of the Shattering. So here we are, standing in the ruins of what was once the greatest civilization the lands between had ever known. We've traced the arc from golden prosperity to catastrophic collapse, from divine order to cosmic chaos. We've watched gods and demigods tear each other apart, while the world burned around them. Now, as we conclude this journey through one of gaming's most devastating civil wars, it's worth asking, what does the Shattering actually teach us? First and foremost, the Shattering demonstrates that power without wisdom is a recipe for disaster. The demigods possessed strength that could literally reshape reality. Radahn held back the stars themselves. Malenia could devastate entire regions with her rot. Rykard consumed gods. Yet for all this cosmic power, they lacked the judgment necessary to wield it responsibly. Their great runes amplified their abilities while simultaneously corrupting their decision-making, creating a feedback loop where increased power led to progressively worse choices. Think about Godrick, desperately grafting limbs onto himself in an endless quest to prove his worth. Each enhancement made him more powerful, but also more monstrous, less capable of inspiring the loyalty necessary to actually rule. Or consider Mohg, whose blood magic grew stronger with every sacrifice, creating a system that could only sustain itself Through ever-increasing atrocity, power became its own justification, divorced from any consideration of purpose or consequence. The Golden Order itself was built on fundamental contradictions that made the shattering almost inevitable. When Marika banished death, she didn't eliminate mortality. She created the conditions for those who live in death, shambling corpses trapped between existence and oblivion. When she declared the omen impure, she didn't prevent their birth. 2 of her own children were born with horns, forcing her to choose between her laws and her family. When she concentrated divine authority in her own hands, she didn't create stability. She ensured that when her rule faltered, there would be no institutional framework capable of maintaining order. Every solution the Golden Order imposed on the world simply postponed problems while making them worse. The suppression of the flame of ruin didn't eliminate fire. It just ensured that when flame returned, it would be wielded by those with grudges against the order. The persecution of alternative beliefs didn't create unity. It drove dissent underground where it festered and radicalized. The elevation of grace-blessed individuals above all others didn't reward virtue. It created a hereditary aristocracy whose claim to superiority rested on divine favoritism rather than actual merit. This brings us to perhaps the most important lesson. Systems built on lies and violence cannot sustain themselves indefinitely. The Golden Order's propaganda presented its rule as eternal, natural, and just. But the reality was conquest, genocide, and the forcible suppression of anything deemed impure or threatening. The fire giants were nearly exterminated. The merchants were persecuted for their beliefs. The omen were treated as abominations. Death itself was sealed away in defiance of natural law. These weren't unfortunate excesses or regrettable necessities. They were the foundation upon which the entire system rested. And when that foundation cracked, the entire structure came down with catastrophic force. The tragedy of the shattering is that nearly every major participant had legitimate grievances or noble intentions. Ranni sought freedom from tyrannical cosmic forces that demanded eternal servitude. Miquella pursued a vision of compassion and healing for those the Golden Order had abandoned. Malenia fought with absolute devotion to protect her brother. Morgott defended order and stability in a world descending into chaos. Even Mohg, for all his corruption, was seeking acceptance and connection after a lifetime of rejection. Yet noble intentions proved insufficient when combined with divine power and competing visions of the future. Each demigod believed, with genuine conviction, that their path represented the best hope for the lands between. Each was willing to sacrifice enormously, including the lives of countless others, to achieve their goals. And each was blind to how their own actions contributed to the very destruction they claimed to oppose. Consider Malenia's devotion to Miquella. Her love for her brother was pure and selfless, yet it drove her to devastate Caelid, transforming a thriving region into a rot-scarred wasteland that would remain uninhabitable for generations. The scarlet Aeonia she unleashed didn't just kill Radahn's soldiers. It poisoned the land, mutated the wildlife, and condemned innocent civilians to death or transformation into monsters. Her devotion became destruction. Her love became plague. Or look at Morgott's tragic loyalty. He defended the Golden Order with unwavering dedication despite being born as an omen that the system deemed an abomination. His nobility was real, his sacrifice genuine. Yet he fought to preserve institutions that had always rejected him, defending a throne he believed he had no right to occupy. His loyalty served no one's interests, not even his own. It was virtue directed toward maintaining injustice, courage spent defending a failed system. The environmental cost of the shattering serves as a stark reminder that in conflicts of this magnitude, ideology and ambition matter less than the physical reality of destruction. Caelid's transformation into a rock wasteland, Lendel's reduction to ruins, the proliferation of those who live in death across the realm. These weren't unfortunate collateral damage. They were the direct and predictable consequences of employing cosmic forces as weapons without regard for long-term effects. The survivors who rebuilt in the wreckage faced a world fundamentally different from the Golden Age. Without the Erdtree's reliable blessing, without clear hierarchies, without the infrastructure that had sustained civilization for ages, they had to create entirely new ways of living. Some communities that emerged were more just and equitable than what came before, built on cooperation rather than hierarchy, on demonstrated contribution rather than inherited status. Others devolved into brutal tyrannies where local strongmen exploited the weak without even the pretense of divine mandate to justify their rule. This brings us to perhaps the most profound question the Shattering poses. Was the Golden Age actually golden, or just gilded? The prosperity and peace that Marika's reign provided, where real cities flourished, arts thrived, knowledge accumulated. But this golden surface concealed systems of oppression and suppression that would eventually explode with catastrophic force. The question isn't whether the Golden Age was better than the Shattering, obviously it was. The question is whether the Golden Order's methods created the conditions that made the Shattering inevitable. The return of the Tarnished represents something genuinely unprecedented in the lands between's recorded history. For the first time, those without divine blood or inherited status could claim the power to reshape reality itself. The Tarnished weren't chosen for their nobility, wisdom, or virtue. They were exiles who had survived generations in harsh wastelands, without grace or divine protection. They had learned to thrive through determination rather than inheritance, to grow strong through adversity rather than blessing. This matters because it means the Tarnished approach the shattered world without the assumptions that constrained previous generations. They have no investment in maintaining the Golden Order's hierarchies because those hierarchies had excluded them. They have no illusions about divine rule's inherent righteousness because they've seen what happens when gods war among themselves. They can look at the wreckage objectively and ask not, how do we restore what was lost? But what should we build from these ruins? The multiple endings available in Elden Ring reflect this unprecedented agency. The Tarnished can restore the Golden Order, learning from its mistakes while maintaining its basic structure. They can embrace Ranni's Age of Stars, removing divine interference entirely and allowing mortals to chart their own destiny. They can accept Fia's vision where those who live in death are integrated rather than persecuted. They can even unleash the frenzied flame, burning away all distinction and reducing existence to primordial chaos. None of these options are perfect. Each represents profound trade-offs and difficult compromises. The restored Golden Order might repeat the same mistakes. The Age of Stars removes divine tyranny, but also divine protection. The frenzied flame destroys both oppression and everything worth preserving. There is no obviously correct choice, no path that solves all problems without creating new ones. And that's precisely the point. The Shattering teaches us that there are no perfect systems, no ideal rulers, no cosmic force that can impose order without eventually creating the conditions for its own destruction. The best we can hope for is to make informed choices about what we value most and what we're willing to sacrifice to achieve it. The legacy of the Shattering continues to shape the lands between in ways both obvious and subtle. The physical scars Caelid's rot, Lendel's ruins, the corrupted Erdtree roots serve as constant reminders of what divine warfare costs. The social trauma, the breakdown of trust between communities, the cynicism about authority, the despair about finding meaning in a world where even gods have failed runs even deeper and will take longer to heal. Yet life persists. Communities rebuild. Children are born who never knew the Golden Age and therefore aren't paralyzed by nostalgia for it. The Tarnished return, bringing with them the possibility that exile and hardship can forge strength of a different kind than divine blessing ever provided. The cycle of history doesn't have to repeat, but breaking that cycle requires genuine understanding of how we arrived at this point. The Shattering wasn't just a war between demigods over a throne. It was the violent revelation of contradictions built into the Golden Order from its foundation. It was the proof that power concentrated in too few hands, justified by claims of divine superiority, will eventually be turned destructively inward when external threats are eliminated. It was a demonstration that suppressing fundamental aspects of existence, death, fire, darkness, impurity, doesn't eliminate them, but merely ensures they'll return in more terrible forms. Most importantly, the Shattering was a lesson about the cost of failing to address systemic injustice before it explodes. The Omen who were hidden away in shame, the merchants persecuted for their beliefs, the tarnished stripped of grace and exiled, the alternative philosophies suppressed, all of these represented cracks in the Golden Order's facade of perfection. Addressing these injustices would have required admitting that the system was flawed, that divine rule wasn't inherently just, that the hierarchy needed to change. Instead, the Golden Order doubled down on its claims to perfection, suppressed dissent more thoroughly, and concentrated power more tightly in divine hands. When the inevitable crisis came, Godwyn's death, proving that even the most blessed could fall, the system had no flexibility to bend. It could only shatter. As we look at the ruins of the lands between and contemplate what the tarnished might build from the rubble, we're forced to confront these questions ourselves. If given the power to reshape reality, armed with knowledge of what went wrong before, what choices would we make? Would we attempt to restore the old order with reforms, create something entirely new, or burn it all down and start over from scratch? These aren't just hypothetical questions about video game lore. They're fundamental questions about power, justice, and the systems we build to organize society. The Shattering serves as both warning and opportunity, a demonstration of how catastrophically wrong things can go when power is wielded without wisdom or accountability, but also proof that even total collapse isn't necessarily the end of the story. The Golden Age fell. The demigods tore each other apart. The lands between descended into ruin and madness. But from that devastation came the possibility of genuine change, of building something better than what was lost, precisely because what was lost was revealed as deeply flawed. Whether that possibility is realized depends on the choices made by those brave or foolish enough to claim the fragments of power scattered across the shattered realm. The Elden Ring can be remade. The question isn't whether it should be, but what form it should take and who gets to decide. The legacy of the Shattering isn't just destruction. It's the space that destruction created for something new to emerge. Whether what emerges is better or worse than what came before remains to be determined. But the opportunity exists, and that alone represents a kind of hope that the Golden Age, for all its prosperity, could never provide. Because the Golden Age was built on the lie that perfection had already been achieved, that the hierarchy was natural and eternal, that the system needed only to be maintained rather than improved. The Shattering destroyed that lie along with everything else. And in the ruins, amidst all the horror and suffering and loss, there's finally space to ask, what do we actually want our world to be? The answer to that question will determine whether the Shattering was merely a catastrophe or also an opportunity, whether the cycle of divine tyranny and violent rebellion continues, or whether something genuinely new can emerge from the ashes of the old order. The lands between await. The choice is yours, tarnished. And so concludes our comprehensive journey through the Shattering, the catastrophic civil war that transformed the lands between from a golden empire into the shattered realm that players explore in Elden Ring. What began with a conspiracy on a single foggy night. The Night of Black Knives escalated into a conflict that destroyed an entire civilization and reshaped reality itself. Godwyn's death proved that even gods could die. Marika's grief-driven shattering of the Elden Ring demonstrated that even cosmic order was fragile. The war that followed showed that divine power without wisdom inevitably leads to catastrophe. We've explored how the Golden Order's fundamental contradictions, its banishment of death, suppression of the impure, and concentration of power in divine hands created conditions making the Shattering almost inevitable. We've witnessed each demigod, blessed with fragments of cosmic power, pursuing their own vision, while lacking the wisdom or restraint to achieve it without destroying everything in the process. We've walked through Lendel's ruins, stood on Caelid's rot-scarred plains, and contemplated the environmental and human cost of divine warfare. We've seen how ordinary people survived in the wreckage, creating new communities from fragments of the old. And we've considered how the Tarnished's return represented both judgment on failed gods and hope for something better. The story of the Shattering ultimately explores the cycle of history, how systems built on suppression and violence inevitably collapse, how power corrupts even noble intentions, and how endings can also be beginnings if we're willing to learn from past mistakes rather than repeat them. As you continue your journey through the lands between, remember that every location tells a story, every enemy has a history, and every choice contributes to determining what kind of world emerges from the ashes. The Shattering destroyed the Golden Age, but it also created the opportunity for something new, something potentially better, if we have the wisdom to build it. Thank you for joining me on this deep dive into one of gaming's most complex and tragic narratives. If you enjoyed this exploration of Elden Ring's lore, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and let me know in the comments which aspect of the Shattering you found most compelling. Should I create follow-up videos on specific demigods, the various endings, or other aspects of the lore? Until next time, keep exploring those epic tales, fellow Tarnished. The lands between await, full of secrets still to uncover and stories still to tell. May you be guided by grace, and may you prove wiser than the gods who came before.